He visited with the SEC, and there were times when he thought they got me. He stated on multiple occasions how sorry he was.
That's the trial lawyer who interviewed Bernie Madoff, while saying there were several times when Madoff brought the SEC to him, but he didn't do anything, and he's remorseful over his massive fraud. This is Taking Stock on Bloomberg. I'm Pim Fox. Does greed and corruption win out in the end? Let's find out. My guest is Arianna Huffington, editor-in-chief of the Huffington Post and the author of the book Pigs at the Trough: How Corporate Greed and Political Corruption Are Undermining America, with a new and updated forward to the book. Arianna, can you explain a little bit about the normal human tendency? I mean, isn't this just something that we're going to have to live with regardless of whatever kind of reforms we put into action?
Absolutely. We're not going to change human nature overnight. But that's why the founders of capitalism, going back to Adam Smith and Alfred Marshall, knew that there had to be a moral foundation to capitalism. Remember that Adam Smith, before he wrote the Bible of capitalism, The Wealth of Nations, he had written a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. So they always knew that. They always knew that you could not simply allow human greed and the tendency to basically make unlimited quantities of money no matter what to prevail, and without some checks and balances. And what's happened really since the Clinton years, this is not a Republican-Democrat issue, because remember, it was during the Clinton years that we abolished a lot of the protections that had been put in place after the Great Depression. For example, the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act that I write about in Pigs at the Trough ended up being incredibly significant, because were it not for that repeal, we would not have had these massive institutions that became too big to fail. And so right now, when we are looking, for example, at the profits that Goldman Sachs announced, just to give one instance, we need to look at what is the contribution of the government bailout to those profits.
Well, but before we get to the government bailout, just step back and talk a little bit about the political climate. Because if you say you go back to, let's say, the Clinton administration, all the way from then through 2009, is it too much to ask that the political class step forward and represent the interests of the taxpayer, or are they representing a particular interest that is really just about their own welfare and their own futures?
Absolutely. I mean, you're putting your finger on the major problem, which is that because of the way campaigns are financed, the influence of Wall Street, the influence of moneyed interests, the influence of lobbyists is incredible. So we've had both through the Clinton years and the Bush years, of course with a greater emphasis on deregulation during the Bush years, the assumption that somehow if you leave everybody to their own devices, the free market will sort it all out. Remember, Alan Greenspan himself said he was surprised that in the end people did not really do what ultimately would be in their own self-interest. And what the lawyer that you just played that soundbite, who had just talked to Bernie Madoff, said is that even Madoff himself expected that to have been caught by the SEC, but the SEC was busy pursuing major criminals like Martha Stewart. So is
it a misplaced sense of priorities on the part of the politicians and on the part of government? I mean, is there something that is endemic about the way the government operates that precludes any kind of change?
At the moment, that's how it looks. That's why we really need the people to pay attention and to wake up and realize there has to be a lot more pressure on the politicians, because Barack Obama, who campaigned on change, who campaigned on taking on the lobbyists, ended up putting in charge of his financial policy Larry Summers, one of the architects of the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, who celebrated the new economy.
He makes an appearance in the original book as well.
Exactly. He makes an appearance in the original book, and of course he now has a central role in what's been happening. And it's almost as though we had Copernicus before Galileo. The people who think that everything revolves around the Earth are the people who still think that everything revolves around Wall Street. And as long as Wall Street is doing fine, then everything is going well. But it just doesn't happen to be true, because we now see Wall Street doing relatively well and the real economy being in serious trouble. And for the sake of saving capitalism. I mean, I believe in the free markets. I studied economics at Cambridge, and I've always been very concerned about how do we save the free markets, how do we save capitalism by actually having checks and balances and protective regulatory measures that curb the greed and irrational exuberance that have gotten us here.
All right, well, I'm going to ask you about curbing all of this greed and irrational exuberance, as well as how to maintain the free market. Coming up, wealth in America, is it a motivator or is it a destroyer of dreams? And what are some of the remedies to get the pigs from feasting on the fat of the land? More with Arianna Huffington on Taking Stock.